Hello and welcome to today's video. My name is Anniken. I design knitting patterns, I teach knitting workshops online and in person, and I sell yarn through my website yarnaddict.co.uk. Welcome to today's video. I post regularly here on YouTube. I do a combination of tutorials, knit and chat videos where I talk about various topics, podcast episodes where I share what I'm knitting and what I'm up to. And also in December, I've been doing Vlogmas videos. I'm not 100% sure whether this can be posted in December or in January. I think it will be December, but I haven't decided yet. So this might be posted in January, but I'm recording this in December. Today, I'm going to talk about swatching, how and why to swatch and how to measure your tension. You can find all my links below this video, including links to my social media and to sign up to my newsletter. So I know a lot of knitters don't like knitting tension swatches. They don't really think it's worth the effort of doing. And by the way, when I say tension, tension and gauge, I think tension is used more in the UK, gauge is used more in the US. To me, tension and gauge means the same thing. I tend to use the word tension because that's the term I use in my patterns, and most British magazines that I work for use the word tension. But tension, gauge, same thing as far as I'm concerned. I'm sure somebody will come along and tell me there are differences, but as far as I'm concerned, it's the same thing. So in this video, I'm going to talk about why you might want to knit a swatch. And it's not just about checking your tension or gauge. By the way, there are other reasons why you want to knit a swatch, although checking your tension or gauge doesn't hurt either. I'll talk about how to knit a tension swatch, some do's and don'ts, and also how to measure your tension, because I found that even experienced knitters and even experienced well-known designers aren't doing it quite right. Now, lots of designers give advice on this topic. I've seen experts, designers, knitting teachers, knitting experts give advice on this. Some things I agree with, some things I don't agree with. Some people are very much, this is the way it is, and my way is the only way. And if you don't agree with me, then you're wrong. I don't agree with that. I do think that some of the advice I have read is wrong. But I do think that some things, when it comes to tension and gauge, is a little bit flexible, shall we say. But I will talk more about that as we go through this video. So if you liked today's video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. And if you are already a subscriber, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And let me know your views on tension, gauge, knitting swatches. How do you knit swatches? Do you not knit swatches? Let me know in the comments below this video. So before I start this video, I do want to say that experts' opinions on what to swatch and how to swatch vary, and I'm not saying that I'm the ultimate authority on this topic. This is just what I've learned over the years that I've been designing, which is about 15, 16, 17 years now, I think, that I've been designing and having patterns published in magazines and by yarn companies. And I've learned a lot during that time, things I didn't know before I started designing. And I've also made a few mistakes over the years. So this is just a culmination of my experience. You can take my advice, you cannot take my advice, that's entirely up to you. Main thing is that you're knitting what you want and you're happy with what you end up with. But if you do find that you quite often end up knitting stuff that you're not happy with, or you're not happy with the fit of it, maybe the way you approach tension and swatching might be at the heart of that problem. So keep watching this video and see if there's anything you can learn. If you have any extra tips to add, then please leave them in the comments below and let me know what your views on these topics are. There are some reasons I knit a swatch that are not related to tension, and there are some reasons why you might want to knit a swatch even if you don't really want to measure your tension. Although I would say if you're knitting a swatch, you might as well measure your tension as well. But I sometimes hear people saying, well, instead of knitting a swatch, I start knitting the sleeve and then I measure my tension on the sleeve, or I just start knitting the body and then after so many centimeters or inches, I measure it. And if it's coming out the right size, then I keep going. And those are all good advice. I sometimes advise people, if they don't want to knit a swatch to do that as well. But there are some other things that you might want to, or there are some other reasons why you might want to knit a swatch. And one of those reasons is to practice any new or difficult stitch patterns. So if you are doing using some new techniques, some stitch patterns you haven't done before, it might be an idea to practice that on a swatch before you cast them for the real thing. So a friend of mine once, many years ago, came to me and said she wanted to knit this pattern, and she was about to buy the yarn for it, and I looked at the pattern and I thought the cable looked a little bit complicated, but I didn't know how good a knitter she was, although I kind of assumed she wasn't that experienced. And I asked her if she'd done cables before, and she said yes. So I said, well, why don't you just go and buy one ball of the yarn, because it was a local yarn shop that she was buying it from. I said, knit a swatch of the stitch pattern and see what you think. And next time I saw her a week later, she said, yeah, I've decided not to knit this sweater because it's too difficult. And basically the cable pattern in this sweater included using 2 cable needles at the same time, which is, I don't think I've ever knitted a cable where you have to use 2 cable needles at the same time. And it was a very nice looking cable, but it did look quite complex. And I think if you are new to cable knitting and you're new to knitting garments, that probably isn't what you want to do for your first project. So she decided not to knit it, and she looked for a slightly easier project. But I felt better having let her discover that for herself, rather than me saying, I think this is going to be too difficult for you. I think sometimes it's better to discover that for yourself, because I don't know what her previous experience was, or how easy or difficult she would find that stitch pattern. Also use the swatch to practice any shaping techniques you're unfamiliar with. So if there are increases or decreases that you haven't done before, you might want to practice those. Any cast off methods, things like that. You might also want to work out what kind of blocking method might suit this project. Does it need to be properly wet blocked and stretched like you would normally do with lace knitting, or does it just need a quick steam iron? So you can actually knit a couple of swatches and block them differently and see what result you get and what you're happy with. Also use the swatch to check washing instructions. So if the ball band says that you can machine wash it, and you put the swatch in the washing machine and it felts, then you wouldn't actually wash the finished item in the washing machine. I have knitted socks in yarn that is machine washable, superwash merino with nylon, and they have felted. So it's a good idea to test the washing instructions on something small before you wash a bigger item, for example, because even if it says superwash or machine washable, I would be careful about that. So try and knit the swatch first, but also just because the swatch washes okay doesn't mean the actual finished sweater will, because a swatch isn't usually that big. And there is a difference between washing a swatch and a big sweater. Mainly the fact that a big sweater, if you put in the washing machine, is likely to get chucked around a lot and may stretch. So if you are going to wash, this is kind of not related to swatching as such, but if you are going to wash a sweater in or bigger item in the washing machine, I do recommend putting it in a mesh washing bag so you can keep it contained and it doesn't get chucked and all the way around your washing machine, especially during the spin cycle. You also want to make sure you actually like the yarn you're knitting with, especially if it's a yarn you haven't tried before. I bought yarn for a whole blanket recently. It was a crochet blanket, and I bought a kit online which included the yarn for a whole big blanket, and I realized very quickly on that I wasn't enjoying crocheting with this yarn, and I ended up giving it to my daughter. But I've seen other people do this. A lady who was in one of my workshops recently, she'd bought I think it was a mystery blanket kit by a popular designer, and she wasn't enjoying it, and she was working on it in my workshop rather than working on the workshop project because she wanted to finish it, but she didn't look that happy about working on it, and she was complaining a bit about it. And I said, well, do you actually like this project? And she said, no, I hate it. I was a bit taken aback, and I was like, well, why are you working on it? And I said, what do you not like about it? She said, I just hate everything. I hate the yarn. There was a lot of different yarns in there. She said, I hate the colours, I hate the style. This also goes back a little bit to what I was talking about in a recent video about mystery knit alongs, because this was a mystery knit along, so she hadn't seen the finished item before she ordered it. But she wasn't enjoying some of the yarns, and she wasn't enjoying the final result. Now, if she had been able to try the yarn out before she's cast on, I'm not saying she may have definitely enjoyed it and made a different decision, but I definitely, with the project that I was working on, my crochet blanket, if I had tried crocheting with the yarn before I started this project, I would not have bought that yarn for that project, because I was not enjoying it, and I ended up giving it to my daughter, and she's making a blanket with that yarn instead. So it might be an idea to try the yarn before you actually buy the whole lot for the sweater, because you might not be able to return it, or you might not be able to find somebody else to destash it to. So if you can buy one ball, I know if you're buying stuff online that might not be feasible because of postage charges and things. So do check out if you can find it from a local yarn shop instead, or if you have a knitting friend who's got the same yarn or a little bit left of the same yarn that they can give to you to try before you buy everything you need for the sweater. Also, you might want to try different needle types. So does the yarn work best with wooden needles, with metal needles? Different fibers, yarn fibers react differently with different needle fibers, needle materials. So for example, if you are knitting with wooden needles and the yarn is quite slippery, that might work very well. If you are knitting with wooden needles and the yarn is less slippery and has a bit of a kind of drag, for example, then that might become frustrating. I know I quite often find that frustrating. Whereas if you're knitting with metal needles, which tend to be quite slippery, and you're knitting with a very slippery yarn, they might just slide off the needles far too quickly. Also, it's different preferences. So if you have different types of needles, wood, metal, carbons, for example, that it might be worth trying a couple of different needle types, especially if you're not 100% happy about the first needle you're knitting with. Also, you might want to see whether it's best to knit it on a circular needle or straight needles. Obviously, some things, if it's knitted in the round, you have to knit on a circular needle. But if it's something that's knitted flat, you can choose to knit on the circular needle, because you can knit flat on a circular needle. So you might decide whether you prefer to knit on a straight needle or a circular needle. You may not be able to decide that from the swatch, because, for example, I can knit a swatch on a straight needle, but I can't knit the width of a sweater on the straight needle because I find it too uncomfortable and it hurts my shoulders too much. But definitely try different types of needle materials, because that can react differently with your yarn. Different types of needle material can also affect your tension. So if you're knitting with needles that are very slippery, or needles that have a bit more drag on it, like wooden needles, can affect your tension as well. So if you're not getting the correct tension, changing your needle type, needle material from like metal to wood, for example, might make a difference. Obviously, this also depends on what needles you have available, because if you only have one type of needle, say for example you have the Nipro Wooden Symphony interchangeable needle set, you might not want to buy other needles just to try them out for a project. But if you have different types of needles, it might be worth trying different type of needle, different material needle, just to see if it makes any difference to your enjoyment of the project and your tension. So how do you knit a swatch? Well, I've seen top designers, like really top designers, experienced designers and experienced knitters, cast on a few stitches, knit a few rows, leave the stitches on their needles. I'm talking a few rows, I'm talking like that much. Leave the stitches on their needle, get their tape measure out and measure it, and then go, yeah, that's good enough. And to be honest, it's not. And I watched a video by a really top designer, very experienced designer with a huge following, do that on YouTube last year, earlier this year, I can't remember. And I did actually challenge him about it and say that I thought that was almost like a waste of time. Have I done it in the past? Maybe, I can't remember. But yes, it's not the way you're going to swatch accurately. If you're going to do that, I kind of feel like you might as well just have a guess and then take it from there. But there are better ways to actually knit a swatch properly. So let's have a look at how to knit a proper swatch. So you want to make sure that you make the swatch big enough. If you're worried about running out of yarn, then what I suggest you do is that you knit the swatch that it needs to, the size it needs to be, and then you cast off and you leave the yarn attached. You don't break the yarn. You can just leave the final loop, your final stitch. You can put one of those padlock stitch markers into it, or you can just make it bigger so it doesn't unravel that easily. And then after you measured your swatch, you can always unravel it, or if you need to, you can leave it as it is, and if you run out of yarn you can unravel it later. But I do recommend that you actually knit the entire swatch and cast off. Hopefully you will have allowed extra yarn in your yarn budget for an extra ball of yarn. It's always a good idea to get an extra ball of yarn anyway in case you run out, but it's also worth getting an extra ball to swatch with. I know if you're buying an expensive hand-dyed yarn and it comes in 100-gram skeins, and it says that you need 3 skeins, and you might want to buy a 4th one, and that skein is £20 a skein, then I know that's expensive. So I do appreciate that that might not always be possible, but ideally if you can, allow a bit of extra yarn for swatching. My patterns, I always overestimate how much yarn is needed, so there should be extra yarn in that allowance for you to be able to swatch. Having said that, it always used to be the advice when yarn used to come mostly in 50-gram balls that you would always buy an extra ball just in case. But I do appreciate that a lot of yarn these days, especially hand-dyed yarn, comes in 100-gram skeins, so that might not be possible. Make your swatch bigger than what the tension information in the pattern says. So if the pattern says knit 20 stitches and 30 rows to measure 10 by 10 centimeters, you should make that swatch bigger than 20 stitches. The area you're measuring should be the area in the center of the swatch. So measuring your 10 centimeters shouldn't take you all the way out to the edge of the fabric. So if the tension says 20 stitches, I would cast on at least 30, between 30 and 36 stitches. I tend to have 2 stitches of garter stitch at the beginning and end of my row, and 3 or 4 rows of garter stitch at the beginning and end of my swatch. I know some knitting experts, designers, teachers say that you shouldn't have garter stitch around the edges of your swatch because the garter stitch is very different from, say, for example, stocking stitch, because the garter stitch is squashed up a lot more than stocking stitch. So I do get that, I take that point, but garter stitch also helps your swatch to lie flat, and it makes it a lot easier, I think, to actually measure your tension. But what I do allow is a few extra stitches. I would have, say, 2 stitches at the beginning and end in garter stitch, and then 2 to 3 stitches either side at least in stocking stitch. So if I allow, say, 5 stitches at beginning and end, so if it says 20 stitches, I would cast on at least 30. So I have 5 stitches at beginning and end that I don't have to measure. You can make something bigger than that. For example, if you're doing something in a stitch pattern that might stretch a lot, like lace, you might want to make the swatch a lot bigger than that. Bigger the swatch and the bigger area you measure your tension over, the more accurate it's likely to be. I think with stocking stitch on the whole, measuring it over 10 by 10 centimeters is probably good enough. I think sometimes for lace, especially because it stretches a lot, if you can measure it over 15 or 20 centimeters, that might be a good idea. Even if the pattern says by 10 by 10 centimeters, there's nothing stopping you from measuring it over 15 or 20 centimeters. If the pattern says 20 stitches equals 10 centimeters and you want to measure it over 15 centimeters, you just take the 20 divided by 2, which is 10, add that 10 onto the original 20. So if you're measuring over 15 centimeters, that should be 30 stitches. If you're measuring over 20 centimeters, then that will just be double what it should be over 10 centimeters. So it's fairly easy to work that out. The most important thing to remember is that the edge stitches will be distorted, so don't ever measure right to the edge. They're also likely to curl, especially if you have stocking stitch right to the edge. So do not measure right to the edge of your fabric. If you are measuring something that makes counting stitches difficult, then you can use stitch markers. So I use these, can you see that? Bright green. I use these padlock stitch markers. You can also just use loops of yarn. So when I knitted this swatch, I put a marker, which way up is this swatch? Is that way up. So I put a marker down here, a few rows after I cast on, and then about halfway through my swatch I put a row, a few stitches in from each edge of the swatch, and I counted the number of stitches in between and I wrote that down, and then I put a marker a few rows before I finished the swatch, and that marker is directly above the marker down here. Then I made a note of how many rows there are between these markers. I know how many rows are from between this marker and this top marker, and how many stitches are between these side markers, and then I finished the swatch, blocked it, and then I measured it, and then say that's 30 stitches and measures 12 centimeters. I then take 30 divided by 12, and then I multiply that by 10 to find the number of stitches per 10 centimeters. By the way, if you can't get the correct tension, and you're not sure you need to go up a needle size or down a needle size, the way I think about it is, if I have too many stitches per 10 centimeters, that means that my stitches are too big. So to make the stitches smaller, I need to go down a needle size. If I have too few stitches per 10 centimeters, that means that my stitches are too small. So to make them bigger, I need to go up a needle size. So that's how I tend to think about it, in terms of whether I need to change needle size. For me as a designer, patterns are written to my tension or that of my sample knitter. So I will usually start by knitting a swatch and determining my tension with that yarn, and then I will write the pattern based on that. Then if my sample knitter knits a swatch and can't get that tension, then I will ask them what their tension is, and then I'll quite often recalculate the pattern to fit their tension. So when somebody says I'm always spot on, I always knit a tension, my tension is always spot on, I'm like, yeah, but is it though? Unless you only ever knit from the same designer. But even my patterns aren't always knitted to the same tension, because sometimes they're knitted to my tension and sometimes they're knitted to the tension of my sample knitter. And I once was asked what's most important, the tension in the pattern or the tension on the ball band. And I would say always the tension on the pattern, because the designer may not use the needle size as recommended on the ball band. But also I once designed some patterns for a yarn company, and it was a brand new yarn that they were launching, and the way they determined what tension information should go on the ball band was to email the 3 designers who were designing patterns for this yarn, and they asked us all to knit a swatch in stocking stitch, measure our tension and let them know what we got, and then they averaged that out. So it wasn't any of our tension, unless our tension was the same, but I don't know, because I didn't ever check what the ball band actually said, because I don't really care what the ball band said. The only useful thing about the tension on the ball band, in my opinion, is to give you a guide as to what needle size that yarn is intended for, but also it will be a guide to substituting yarn. So if I decide I want to substitute the yarn used in a pattern, my first port of call would be to look at what the ball band says regarding to tension, and then try and find the yarn that has the similar tension on the ball band, because then hopefully they might knit up to the similar tension. Then I would knit a swatch and compare that to what the pattern says. But I might do another video more on substituting yarns, because there are a few other things to bear in mind as well. You should also wash, block, steam press, whatever you're going to do your swatch before you measure it. So I did recently see a very well-known designer with a huge following. It might have been the same designer that I mentioned earlier. Basically say in a video very recently that you didn't need to block or wash your swatch before you measured the tension. That is your knitting tension that's in the pattern, not the finished tension. Now I know for a fact that this person do not write their own patterns or grade their own patterns. I know that they have somebody who does that's done by a yarn company. I don't want to say too much because some of you probably know who I'm talking about. But I also know that when I design for magazines, for example, they will quite often send the finished sample to their technical editor, who will check the pattern, and they will compare the measurements and tension on the sample compared to what and compare it with what I've written in the pattern. Now my tech editor, who does my self-published patterns, she doesn't actually get the sample. She just has to trust my information. So if my maths isn't working out correctly, she will say, can you double check the measurements and the tension because it's not adding up, and then I will go and double check it. But she's trusting what I say. But I know that a lot of magazines will actually send the finished sample to their pattern checker or technical editor, and they will then compare the finished sample to what I put in the pattern. Because I had a pattern recently where I blocked it, I measured the size and the tension immediately after blocking it, and then with posting and handling and things, it shrunk back a little bit. So when the pattern checker checked the pattern, it wasn't measuring what I measured it at, and we had a lot of emails back and forth trying to iron this out. So quite often when you block stuff, especially if it's lacy and you stretch it, it will then quite often shrink back a bit afterwards. Some things will also stretch a bit with wear, so it just depends on what it is and what fabric is made up of, on the thickness of the yarn and things like that. So the tension may change from what it was when you knitted it compared to what it is after you've worn it for a few times, which can be frustrating, but that's just how knitted fabric behaves sometimes. It's kind of like a living fabric, if you like, and it can vary after a while. But I would say that it would be good practice to wash your swatch if you're going to wash the finished item, and block it or leave it flat to dry, or steam iron it. So for example, I'm working on a cardigan at the moment which is knitted in DK yarn, and it's knitted all in one, so it's gonna have to be blocked all in one, and I have a fairly tight deadline for it, and I know that I'm not going to wash it and wet block it before I send it back to the magazine, because it is winter and it's cold at the moment and it will take too long to dry, especially because it's DK yarn and it's 2 layers of fabric, because it's knitted in the round. So I'm not going to do that. I am going to just steam iron it before I send it back to the magazine. I did wash the original swatch, so I just need to make sure, I just need to pay attention to whether my finished tension matches that of the original swatch, which I think it probably will do. It is stocking stitch. It isn't knitted at a particularly loose or tight tension, so I think it'll be okay. But ideally, you should wash something before you measure the final tension. And I know the problem then becomes if you knit the swatch and you wash it and you block it, and it blocks are bigger than it was before you washed and blocked it, which is quite often the case, especially with lace. When you're knitting the item, it will look smaller. And if you're knitting it to a certain length, so if it says knit 30 centimeters, that 30 centimeters is after it's blocked, and sometimes that can be difficult to determine. So I know there are problems with that, and this is what this particular big name designer was saying, that it's your knitting tension, not your finish tension, because it can change during finishing. And I agree with that, but the tension in the pattern is always the finished tension from, it's usually measured from the finished sample. So I will measure my tension from my swatch before I write the pattern, and then when I finish the sample, I will always double check the tension with the finished sample. And if it varies from my swatch, I will use the tension from the finished sample, because my tech editor will go, and if I say it's 20 stitches per 10 centimeters, they will go, okay, that's 2 stitches per centimeter, and they will use that to check all the maths in that pattern, to check that it's measuring the width that I say it's measuring. So if the tension I use is from the swatch, then the measurements that I put in the pattern wouldn't be correct, for example. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. I will usually in my patterns put in the tension information after blocking. I think sometimes it might be useful to give the tension information before and after blocking, and I don't always do that. So when you measure tension, I recommend you use a solid ruler rather than a tape measure. Tape measure is a bit more stretchy. If it's an old tape measure, it may have stretched a bit. I always try and use a ruler. Sometimes I've used a tape measure if I haven't had a ruler handy, but I always try and use a ruler because I can lay that down on the fabric, lay it flat on the fabric, and it stays in place easier as I'm counting. If I don't use a ruler, if I use a tape measure, I find that can move a bit easier. And then I also use a knitting needle or a sewing needle, and what I'll do is I'll put the fabric down on the table. I will put the ruler on top of it, and I will sometimes, if it's something that's difficult to measure, I might use markers or pins and actually mark the 1 and 10 centimeter mark on my on the fabric. But usually what I'll do is I'll line up the 0 centimeter with the edge of a fabric, with the edge of a stitch, and then I will go to the 10 centimeters, and then I'll count back, and I will actually put my needle into the center of each single stitch as I'm counting it, because that way if I lose track, my needle is actually stabbed into the fabric, and I can, if I find it easier. If I'm counting rows, I will actually go into each row. So if it's something that's difficult to count, a fabric that's difficult to count because the yarn's a bit fussy or whatever, I might actually stick my needle into each single row as I'm counting. It can be difficult to count stitches and rows, but it's something that gets better with practice. I will also quite often count it in different places on the fabric, because sometimes the fabric can vary a little bit. Our tension varies a little bit according to how stressed or relaxed we are, how cold or warm we are. And then you have things like this. This is a swatch for a recent sample for Knitting Magazine. So this is, I don't know how wide it is. Let me just have a quick look. So this measures, so the actual full swatch is 16 centimeters, and the bit inside the garter stitch is 14 centimeters. But this isn't very long. It's not 10 centimeters long. It is, with the garter stitch edges, it is, oh, it's 11 centimeters long. But that includes the garter stitch. The stocking stitch section is only 8 centimeters long. But I didn't actually knit this to measure the tension. This was done as a design swatch. So when I submit to a magazine, I have to actually knit a swatch of what the stitch pattern will look like. And then I will take a photograph of that and put that together with all my other design submission stuff and send that off in a Word document or PDF to the editor. So this was just intended to show what the stitch pattern would look like. It was not intended to be used as a gauge swatch or tension swatch. But this is also difficult because these color blips or these color sections are done in garter stitch. So for this one, I think I actually, when I wrote the pattern, for one thing, when the yarn arrived, I knitted the swatch in the actual yarn. But I think because the color is only on the yoke, I actually knitted the gauge swatch or tension swatch in stocking stitch, and I measured the tension in stocking stitch rather than this stitch pattern. I don't think this stitch pattern affects the tension hugely, but it is a little bit more difficult to count because of the way the stitch pattern works. If this was all over the sweater, I would probably use markers to mark off a section, make a note of how many stitches and rows that is, and then measure it, and then do the maths afterwards. This one has a row of garter stitch halfway down, and I think I just tried, I think that was just to denote a change in needles. So again, this was not the finished tension swatch. I just wanted to show the stitch pattern. This was a recent design in Knitting Magazine, and is holding I can't remember if it was 4-ply and Surrey alpaca together, or DK and Surrey alpaca together. But it has this lace pattern, and then it has stocking stitch. And I tried it in 2 different needle sizes to see which one worked better. So this row of garter stitch in the middle is where I changed needle size. So this section is a smaller needle size than this section. This stocking stitch section is wide enough to measure the stitch tension, but not tall enough to measure the row tension. I also quite often get asked what's more important, row or stitch tension, and I would say that depends. Both matter. I would say for most sweaters that are either knitted from the bottom up or top down, where the stitches determine the width of the fabric, I would say that stitch tension is probably more important, because it will determine whether the sweater will fit you. If it's knitted sideways, then that's a little bit more different. But if it's knitted top down and bottom up, I would say stitch tension is a little bit more important because it would determine whether the sweater will fit you or not. But row tension, and a lot of patterns are written to, instead of knit 100 rows, it will say knit till the garment measures 40 centimeters, for example. But depending on the construction method and what sleeves it has, for example, so if it has set-in sleeves with like a shaped sleeve cap, then you need a row tension to determine the shaping of that sleeve cap. So if your row tension is out, that might make your sleeve cap too big or too small. So there are times when row tension matters, but if you have to pick one or the other, I would say in most patterns, stitch tension is probably a little bit more important than row tension. We'll also always recommend that you actually double check something while you're knitting it. So as you're knitting something, just after a little bit, and I have noticed on a lot of stuff that I knit that when I first cast on, it looks really wide, and I'm thinking this is going to be way too wide. Then after I knitted about that much, I'm like, oh, this might be too narrow. Might not be big enough. So when you first cast on for something, it does always look a lot wider than it actually is, and when you get a few centimeters, inches into it, it kind of settles into its actual width, is what I would say. I don't know whether anyone else has noticed that, but I definitely do notice that. So I would not double check so I will always recommend that you double check the width of what you're knitting to make sure it's coming out wide enough if you're knitting from the bottom to the top or top to the bottom. Make sure it's going to fit you around your circumference, so just check the width, that is coming out roughly what it's supposed to be, or at least big enough to fit you, even if it's slightly smaller or slightly, I mean, if it's like 1 centimeter bigger or smaller than what you're making, that may not make a difference. It may still fit you, but if it's 5 centimeters bigger or smaller than what you're expecting, then that might mean it doesn't fit you. So it is worth checking the width, but you do have to knit, I would say, at least 10 centimeters, 15-20 centimeters before you can do that. You can always knit the sleeves first and measure the sleeves so that you've wasted less knitting time if you have to rip it out. And remember, the swatch can lie to you. Difference in the number of stitches on your needles, in the amount of weight on your needles, can make a difference in how your final tension ends up. So your swatch can lie to you, especially with fabrics that are very stretchy like lace. Your swatch can definitely lie to you. So do keep an eye on your fabric as you're knitting. If your gut is telling you that this is ending up way too big or way too small, then stop and take the time to measure. You may even want to put your stitches on a piece of waste yarn and block it and wash it just to check what the final measurements will end up like before you carry on, rather than knit the whole thing and then find it is way too big or way too small. Don't let the issues I've highlighted regarding tension stop you from knitting something that will need to fit. For things where fit is not essential, tension is not as important, although it can affect the final size and the amount of yarn used. So all my shawl patterns, for example, do say that tension is not essential. Exact tension is not essential, but will affect the amount of yarn used and the final size. Something like that is the disclaimer in my patterns. But if it's something that needs to fit, then your tension needs to be roughly spot on for it to fit the way you want it to fit. But don't let a worry about that stop you from knitting something that you want to knit. Just keep an eye on it as you're knitting it, and if you have a gut feeling that it's coming out too big or too small, listen to that gut feeling and don't be afraid to rip out and re-knit. I know it's frustrating, but it is better than wasting the yarn or ending up with something you can't wear. A lot of stuff about tension there. Let me know what you think. Do you check your tension? Have you had any problems with tension in the past? Do you always get correct tension the first time you check it? Do you never get correct tension? Are you a tight knitter or a loose knitter? Let me know in the comments below. Ask any questions you have, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. And thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.